At this point, we have the 5 basic pieces that we need for the lower part of the cabinet, and they're all cut to size, and the joinery is cut, the dados and the rabbets. On the side pieces, I also drilled the holes for the locking mechanism, and then here what will be the front edge of the side piece for the pivot pin. Now, in order for that top to pivot down, I'll need some clearance, so I want to round over the top corner of the side piece. And to do that, I'll use the same process that I used on the pedestal before. In fact, I'll use the same template, and I bring it up and just mark on the side piece this radius, use a jigsaw to rough cut it, and then to smooth it out, I'm going to do a little bit different same process, different bit. So before I used a flush trim bit, and in this case it's called a pattern bit. It's a straight bit with a bearing on the top of the bit. And the way this works, it's very similar. The bearing here will follow, I'll move the template right up to the edge, and the bearing will follow along the template as I route and make a nice smooth cut. Now, in order to put the template down on the workpiece, once again, we'll use our old friend double-sided tape, and when it's stuck down, then I can route that radius corner nice and smooth. After it's routed, I'm ready for assembly. Now, when you're working with pieces that are sort of this large and kind of heavy, it helps to have a friend come in with an extra set of hands. I asked some of the guys if they could help out. They scattered. So now I'm working alone, so that often happens in the shop. And how do you assemble pieces that are large and awkward if you're working alone? Well, 2 things help out. One is to have some clamping aids and holding devices to hold the pieces in place. The second is, if you can, to assemble the project in stages. So we're going to do both of those things. And the first part will be to assemble just half of the cabinet. So I'm going to work with the side piece down first, then add the bottom, the shelf, and the top. Then what I'll do is add the other side pieces up on top here, but I will not glue it in place. So I only have to worry about glue on this one side piece. So the other part of this, that's the first stage of doing this. The other part of this is to use some kind of help for assembly using some jigs and devices. The first one I'm using are these 4x4 blocks that raise the workpiece up off the surface of the bench so I can get the clamp heads in place. Now I can start assembly, and I'll start by adding the bottom piece. Now it's in this rabbet, and so there is no support at all. This is the most difficult piece to add. Nothing to support it, going to wobble around. So how do I support this piece? So I have a little helper here. It's an alignment block, and it has dados cut at a right angle. One of these dados fits over the side piece, and the other one will be used to support the bottom. Now, to align it, I'll just use a piece of scrap, put it in the rabbet, and bring this up and move it around so that now I know that my alignment block is already aligned with a piece the bottom that'll go in here, so I don't have to mess around with that. Now I can bring up the bottom and just slide it into place, and you can see with that alignment block in place, it holds it nice and steady. I don't need any friends, so this is good. Now that's in place, but you can see it wobbles around a little bit. So it's held in place, but it's not at a right angle. So the second helper that I'm going to use, it is a right angle squaring jig. So this is cut at a right angle, and you see the corner is knocked off here, so no glue squeeze out will be a problem. And then also if there's any sawdust around, that won't goof up the alignment of your jig. So I'll bring it up, and this is kind of done in 2 stages. I will loosely clamp it in place, and then I'll push it up to make sure that the bottom and the side, there's no gap with this squaring jig along the both arms. And when that's okay, now I can tighten down the bottom side, and then I'll bring up another clamp and tighten the other arm. And I know with the alignment block and the squaring jig that I've got this piece held in place and it's square. The next piece to add is our middle shelf, and we'll do that the same way. We'll use an alignment block, slip it on here, and then use a piece of scrap to align the alignment block. So now we know the scrap aligns the alignment block, and we can bring up our shelf. And just drop it into place. Okay, there we go. So now on this piece, I won't use that squaring jig, and you'll see why in just a little bit. I'm going to move on to the top. Once again, using an alignment block, putting it in place, using a test piece to align the alignment block. Now I can bring up the top. Just have to make sure that all my dados are on the top, and I'll just slide it in place. Okay, pretty good. Now, on this piece I will go ahead and I'll use that squaring jig. So I'll bring it up, same procedure, loosely clamp it in place, and then I can move it up, make sure that both arms are in full contact with the workpieces. Then I can tighten it down and bring up a second clamp to clamp the other arm in place. So I have the three pieces in place, and I mentioned that I don't have that squaring jig on this middle piece. And the reason for that is now I'm going to go ahead and add the second side. So I'll bring that piece up here, put it in the rabbet, and align the dados, and then drop it in place. So what I'm sure of is because of the clamping square, the top is aligned with the side, and the shelf now, because of I've added this side, the middle shelf is perfectly aligned with the side. So this dry assembly process is really important for two reasons. First of all, I know I have all my equipment, the clamps, the clamping squares, all the aids to assemble this project. Everything's in place and I don't have to rush around when glue goes on. But second, and probably the most important to me, is that I've actually gone through the process once. So I feel much more comfortable as glue goes on and I don't have to rush. So now it's a matter of disassembling the project. So I'll take this side off. And then as I disassemble, in this case, when I take the top off, I'm only going to take off one arm of this clamping square. And I'll leave this in place because I know it's in exactly the right position and it'll make that top square. I'll take off the middle shelf. And then the same thing on the bottom is just take off one arm. So now I'm ready to start applying glue. So I'll just add a little bead of glue on this rabbet and then use a brush to brush it out here a little bit. Okay, and that should do it. Now I just have to add the bottom on here. And then clamp this in place with my squaring jig. And I'll continue on with that same process, run a bead of glue in my dado, brush it out, add the middle shelf, then go ahead and add the top, and I'll finish it all off by adding that side piece to align everything. So I'll get going on all that. That fits pretty well. At this point, we have put glue in the dados and the rabbet for the bottom, the shelf, and the top, and glued and clamped all that together. Now, before I move on, I have a perfect opportunity to go ahead and take the measurements, both measurements for the back. And I can cut it to size and then put it in place. Now, the back actually serves three purposes. First of all, it's the back to the cabinet. Second, there's a groove cut in it, and that'll help support this middle shelf to prevent it from sagging. But third, and probably most important, is that when the back is in there and we start to glue the other side piece in place, it'll keep this entire assembly square and prevent it from racking. So in order to, I can cut this to size, but then I have to locate the groove for this center shelf here. And instead of cutting that groove in my good piece, I'll simply use, as I always do, a piece of scrap and cut a groove, take a measurement, and then make a test fit and see if that groove fits. And in this case, it does. So now I have the measurement between the rabbet and the top part of the shelf. And I also know that the groove is the right depth because all this is flush on the back. So once the groove is cut in this test piece, now I can go ahead and cut the same groove in the same location in the back. Now I'm ready to put that all into this assembly. So I'll unclamp everything, apply glue in the rabbets, put the back in place, put glue in the two dados and the other rabbet, put the side in place, and then clamp this entire assembly together and know that it's nice and square because the back is in there. At this point, the bottom part of our cabinet is all assembled. The back held everything square during glue up and clamping, but it also holds the whole cabinet square and prevents it from racking after it's assembled. The next step is to attach the cabinet to the platform. Now this is just a matter of screwing up through the bottom, screwing and gluing the cabinet to the platform. Now I can start cutting the dividers that fit in these dados that are across the top of the cabinet. The problem here is that the dividers have to fit from the bottom of the dado up flush with the top of the sides, and there's no good way to measure that. So I have to basically start cutting one of these pieces to size and sneak up on the height until it's flush. And I'll just check that with a square until I'm sure that the top of the divider is flush with the top of the side piece. After the first one is cut, now I can cut the other three to this same height, and I'm sure that that'll be flush all the way across the whole cabinet. And finally, I'll cut these dividers to width, that is the front to back distance. Now there's a couple of more steps to complete on these dividers before I can actually add them to the cabinet. So first of all, I need to drill a hole for the pivot pin. Now this hole, it's critical that that's absolutely aligned with the hole that's already drilled in the side of the cabinet. Now aligning those two holes is actually easier than it seems, because when I drilled the first hole in the side of the cabinet, I left the same setup on my drill press with the fence and the stop block. So this second hole in the divider, exactly the same position. Next, I have to drill another oversized hole near the back, and that's to get access to a bolt. And we'll see about that a little bit later, but I used a Forstner bit to drill this hole. And finally, on the front edge of all the dividers, I wanted to round that off, and I used the same process using a template, a jigsaw, and a pattern bit to smooth this out. Now there's one last step on these dividers. The dividers actually form two pairs, And the pairs are joined together by first cutting dados into the two dividers for the pair. And then in that dado, there's a shelf. It fits right in here. The other divider fits right up on top of that. And you create this H assembly. This assembly then just fits right in the dados that we already cut in the top of the cabinet. So it should drop right in. There's one more piece to cut, and that's the back. Now it has a groove and a dado, and that fits over the back side of the dividers and the shelf and holds all this together. This assembly does two things. First, it creates a compartment for storage, but most important, it creates a very stable anchor point for our pivot pin and a pocket here on the side between the divider and the side of the cabinet for the tilting mechanism for the router table top. Now, once all these pieces are cut, dry assembled together, then I can take them all apart and then add glue and clamps and assemble the whole cabinet. Well, the cabinet base for our router table is just about complete. All that's left to do is to make the doors to cover up the storage compartments. Now, I decided to use MDF for the doors. It's cheap, and to use a simple overlay door that's easy to install. Now, in order to cut the doors to size, on the bottom doors, I just measured from side to side, top to bottom. And then for these doors, I decided on the bottom here to trim off about 3/8 of an inch just to give a little clearance over the platform, and to trim on the inside edge so there's about an 1/8 inch gap just to make the doors easier to open. On the top doors, these smaller ones, the measurement just goes down so there's a small clearance right above the bottom door, and then they measure all the way out from the divider out to the side. Once the doors are all cut to size, there's just a couple of more steps to do. Well, the first thing to do is to round over the inside and outside edges of the door. These edges are prone to getting nicked, and rounding them over will prevent a lot of that. This is pretty simple, just using a 1/4 inch round over bit and then rounding over those two edges. The next thing is to add some way to open the doors. Now, I didn't want knobs on the front of the doors. That'd get in the way. So instead, I used a simple cove on the back side of the door as a finger pull. Now, in order to make this long cove cut, I actually marked the center lines of where this cove is going to start and stop. And then to route it, I used a 1/2 inch cove bit with a bearing in a handheld router. So how is all this going to work? Well, on the large doors for the bottom of the cabinet, I clamped them down to the bench, and then I marked the start and the stop lines for that cove. Now, one of the problems for these large doors is this cove is going to be cut pretty close to the edge, inside edge of the doors. So I decided to clamp both doors down, put a clamping caul across them. That gives me a surface for my router base to ride on as I'm making this cut. Now, since I'm marking a center line for this start and stop point, I also needed a center line on my router. So I just put a piece of tape on the router base and marked a line where the center of the router bit is. Now, to make the cut, I'll align that line, the center line on the tape with the center line on the workpiece, plunge into the workpiece, route across to the stop line, and then pull that out. So I'm ready to route. Plunge in on the start line, pull out on the stop line, and do the same for the other cove. Well, there's one last cut to make on the doors, and that is to cut a rabbet on the back side of the doors in order to mount a hinge. Now, in this case, I wanted to use a continuous hinge, that is, one that runs the entire height of the door, and it's set into a rabbet to help align the hinge as you're mounting it. Now, this rabbet is cut to size so that the depth equals the thickness of one flap of the hinge, and the width is equal to the distance from the edge of the flap to the center line, or just a little bit less than the center line of the knuckle. And that helps align this hinge on the door. Now you'll notice that I cut this rabbet on a scrap piece. It actually happens to be the same scrap that I used to cut a test cove for my door before. So it's handier to cut, a lot easier to cut this on a test scrap piece than to goof up something on the doors that you have invested so much time on. So once you know you've set that up, you've got the dado set in here. It's the right height for that flap and the right width for the flap. And now I'm ready to go ahead and cut the rabbet on the back side of all the doors. Push the edge of the door against the fence and make the rabbet cut. Then repeat this cut on the other 3 doors. Well, this rabbet really helps to align the continuous hinge on the back of the door. Now to mount this hinge, I'll just drill some pilot holes and then screw it in place. Now I typically like to use a self-centering bit and drill 1 pilot hole first. Then after with the hole drilled, I can mount the first screw at the top here. Now that'll hold the hinge in place and for me to drill the remaining holes. But you can see when I turn the flap over that the flap goes sort of too far. What I want is for these 2 flaps to be parallel when I install them in the cabinet. And to get that parallel, I'll just use a spacer in between the 2 flaps. Now, the 2 flaps are parallel, and there's one more issue. I have to hold this hinge and this flap against the side of the cabinet in order to install it. But I don't have enough hands to do that, so I'm going to turn to our old friend, double-sided tape. And when I put the tape on there, it will look like this. Double-sided tape, and then I'll put the spacer in between the 2 flaps that holds those flaps parallel, remove the backing from the tape, and now I can take it over to the cabinet. And now to install it, I know I want a little space in between the bottom of the door, top door, and the top of the bottom door. So I've added a spacer strip in here. And now I'll put the door in place, and I'll align, make sure that this is aligned on this inside edge, nice and flush. And then I can press the hinge with the double-sided tape against the side of the cabinet. So using double-sided tape, and we'll open this up, remove our spacer, that'll hold the hinge and the door in place on the cabinet side. And then I can come back and get my drill, switch back to the self-centering bit, and I'll drill pilot holes in the 4 holes here to mount the hinge. Then I can screw it in place, and then I'll repeat that process on the other side of the cabinet for the other small door at the top here. And with those doors installed, our base cabinet for the router table is complete.